the various areas. I think in a way it has, it has been insightful for us to know what these areas are. May I go on now to the next speakers, and may I also request the speakers to, not to go beyond 15 minutes. This is because we just have an hour, an hour to go. And also we have, apart from the 3 speakers that we are going to have, and that is Raghunandanji and Soumya, you are here, perhaps you could come here to the, and a conversation with Sudhir Sharma. We have one more speaker whom we would like to invite, and that is Nitin Sethi. We are fortunate to have you here, and he will share with us, on the Sino-US climate deal. I think we have, in that sense, 4 speakers to go. So may I request the speakers to kind of limit yourselves to, maximum 15 minutes. May I request Raghunandanji to share with us, your insights from the IPCC?
Thank you, Nafisa. I hope I will be able to restrict myself to 15 minutes. I'll certainly do my best. I'll request Nafisa to give me a little tap at 10 to 12 minutes, then I know when to wrap up. Otherwise, I think if we continue like that, the last speaker may end up having only 2 minutes. So I'll talk about the IPCC's report and what that portends for the agreement to come in Paris. I'm fully aware, as we would have seen from Indrajit's presentation, that there are, in the negotiations, a very large number of issues that are going to come up for debate. And at each of them there are potholes, quicksand, where things can get bogged down. But to my mind, whatever happens on all these other issues, on the form, on the legal form, on adaptation, technology, all of these agreements or disagreements will finally see that the deal is either made or not made based on the mitigation commitments that finally come to the table in 2015. Because if we don't achieve the mitigation targets, and this is what the IPCC's 5th assessment report makes clear, if we don't achieve the mitigation targets that we need to in order to reach the 2 degrees Celsius global goal, then none of the other stuff is going to matter. It doesn't matter who gives technology to anybody else. It doesn't matter how much adaptation we do. It doesn't matter how much technologies come and go or how much money is put on the table. If 2 degrees centigrade is gone by the wayside and we reach 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees, then none of this other stuff is going to matter. So I think what the IPCC report has given us in terms of the science, despite all the political maneuverings that have gone on for the wording in the synthesis report and the summary for policymakers, fortunately the science of it is not really open for debate. You don't get particular government saying, no, it should not be 49 gigatons of carbon. I think it should be 33 gigatons of carbon, because these numbers are agreed upon by the science, and there is no disputation on those. And surprise, surprise, what the 5th assessment report of the IPCC says is that the degree of certainty with which we know that runaway climate change is around the corner if we don't take steps now, the degree of certainty with regard to that has increased even more. And this has been the case from the very first assessment report. Every successive assessment report has made an upward revision of the degree of certainty, has put numbers on the table which are more definitive than the previous one, which have greater support from scientific observations, from measurements done through a variety of instruments, whether it is satellite-based or other, through predictive models. All these have increased the degree of certainty with which the predictions have been made. I would just like to highlight 3 or 4, I think, important points which I believe should guide the deliberations leading up to Paris, and whether this guidance of the discussions and the negotiations work to actually guide the discussions inside the conference room, or whether they will guide deliberations inside the conference room because of deliberations, calculations, estimates made outside the conference room, which would then exert pressure on the negotiations inside, is something to be seen. And I think Soumya, when he speaks of closing the emissions gap, will perhaps throw a little more light on this. First off, as far as the IPCC is concerned, there's one significant change which has taken place between the 4th assessment report and the present one, which is that most predictions, estimations and scenarios in the 4th assessment report were made till 2050. IPCC's 5th assessment report makes most of its scenarios and predictions till the end of the century, till 2100. Now this works both ways. If you read through the report casually, you may feel that this gives us all a lot more breathing room than we had. Because 2050 sounds, we've got another 30 years to go. 2100, you think, it's okay, we've got a lot of time, maybe another 30 years later we can wake up and do it. But those who would read the report a little more carefully would see that within this framework of a scenario till 2100, the 5th assessment report makes some fairly startling and clear predictions and scenarios for the period till 2050 as well. Primarily, it makes clear that whatever scenarios are envisaged for 2100, for the period till 2100, if certain actions are not taken by 2050, then those scenarios till 2100 will not be realized. That is to say, what we envisage till 2100 is predicated upon what we achieve by 2050. So 2050 still remains the goal for taking action, and if we don't take action within this period till 2050, you will see what the report calls spillovers, or if you look at it in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and a stabilization level of 450 parts per million or thereabouts, IPCC's 5th report says that this will cross to 500 or 550, in which case recovery by 2100 will not be possible, staying within 2 degrees Celsius will not be possible, and then you will have to countenance going to 3, 3.5 or maybe even 4 degrees by 2100. So that's one. The second, I think, highlight of the 5th assessment report is that it gives us a number, which is a total carbon budget for the period from the commencement of the industrial era, from 1750 onwards, which will have to be kept within if we want to reach the 2 degrees Celsius goal. So we have a total number. We have a number which says till now This much carbon is already put in the atmosphere, and that gives you a remaining carbon budget for the world. So this number is now available with the fifth assessment report, and this is the second, I think, difference between the fifth and the earlier assessment reports. The earlier assessment report spoke of stabilization levels, spoke of greenhouse gas concentrations. Now we have got a number which talks not of these earlier numbers, stabilization level, greenhouse gas concentrations. You would still have to derive other numbers regarding how much emissions need to be put in order for 450 ppm to be reached. The same is the problem with the 2 degrees Celsius goal. The 2 degrees Celsius is an outcome, but what you can calculate, what you can monitor, what you can count, and what you will have to negotiate is not the 2 degrees Celsius goal or the 450 ppm goal, but what your country, your country, your country, and my country put into the atmosphere, which will result in, which will have the outcome of 450 ppm or 2 degrees Celsius. And that number has been put on the table by IPCC fifth assessment report in terms of the carbon budget. So you don't have to now rack your brains regarding what does 2 degrees Celsius mean in terms of how much you put in, and what this totals up to. That number is now available in the IPCC report. I don't want to go into the details because I think all of you will see it. The numbers are fairly clear. The numbers are not very different from what they were known earlier, except, as I said, that they have been cast in terms of end of the century, 2100 rather than 2050. It is also known that so let me just wrap up this number section now. And the number section says that out of the total carbon budget till 2100, we have already exhausted more than half within just the past 40 years. And therefore, the rate at which we are exhausting the remaining carbon budget is very small. And if you go by the carbon budget numbers, what this tells you in terms of what needs to be achieved is that if you've got today a total annual emissions of about 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent for all the nations put together, in order to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius goal, we need to get about 15 to 50, 15 to 25 gigatons of CO2 by the end of the century. That's it, total. So about 1/3 of where we are today. That's the cumulative number that we have to reach into. Plus the fifth assessment report gives you some numbers as to what you need to achieve by mid-century, and therefore which will make it necessary for you to attain that. The second aspect on which I'd like to focus our attention based on these numbers is, and this was something which was spoken of by Indrajit, and I'm sure Soumya is going to throw more light on this. No scientific calculation will tell us if this is the total carbon budget, what is the share that different countries must take. This is not something to be dictated by science. Science cannot say American carbon dioxide molecules should be so much and Chinese carbon dioxide molecules should be so much. There's no science which tells you that. Carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide. This burden sharing between countries is not for science to arrive at. It's for a political, negotiated solution. But what guides this politics? It can't just be might is right who shouts loudest or who grabs the most carbon share does it. The only possible way of thinking about this is what Indrajit spoke of, which is fairness. And how do you work out fairness? By working out an allocation of this carbon budget, the cumulative emissions, because we are talking nationally for each nation based on its population. That is a per capita entitlement to the global commons, worked out from the beginning of historical time, amounting for historical emissions, subtracting that and allocating on the basis of a fair share. Those of you who are interested, more than 5 years ago, we had brought out this paper. This is available on our Delhi Science Forum website, which looks at this allocation of the remaining carbon budget based on fair shares of historical entitlement, etc., because each country was entitled to so much. Now, the only point I want to make with regard to that is whether or not these allocations of carbon budget by fair share form a, yes, thank you, 3 minutes more? Whether or not these form a part of negotiations on the table, whether or not these actually form the yardstick enshrined into a final agreement, I am less bothered than whether we as civil society and as the scientific community and others use these methods as a yardstick to assess the adequacy of the agreements arrived at or in the process of being arrived at across the table. Because what is it that we are saying? If you look at the two poles of the negotiations going now, the pledge and review system and a strict top-down system. Pragmatists among us would perhaps with some justification say a purely top-down solution is not going to work because there are very powerful groups who are working against it. They will not let it happen, and so you're going to end up with some kind of a pledge and review system. My big question is, I've seen pledges since Copenhagen onwards. Where's the review? There's only been pledges. How do you do a review of these pledges? You sum all the pledges that have been made, and the IPCC's fifth assessment report specifically says all the pledges at Cancun onwards, which is what is enshrined, if you add them all up, are nowhere near adequate to meet the 2050 goal. Forget about the 2100 goal. Who is going to weigh this adequacy, and how is it going to be done? How is it going to be measured? This is where the emissions gap issue comes in. But the emissions gap will talk about global emissions. How do you work out the adequacy or inadequacy of the national emission targets? If there is a process, you do pledges from below, you weigh this against the 2 degrees Celsius goal and the carbon budget, and if the pledges amount to less than what is required to achieve the carbon budget and the 2 degrees centigrade goal, will you come back to the negotiating table and revise these pledges upwards? If the US and China have made certain pledges now, is that a starting point or a final declaration of what is going to be done? I think this is crucial. One needs a yardstick by which to measure this, and the yardstick from the point of view of science and ethics can only be two. One yardstick is the total carbon budget, and the second yardstick is an ethical system of assessing fairness by dividing up the atmospheric commons among the different nations based on their per capita occupancy or otherwise. I don't see a third method. Everything else is fungible or reducible to this. Whether you add more criteria, to define equity, you have an HDI, you want to add 5 more features to that, you want to add capability and so on. Ultimately, the more factors you add up, I think the more difficult negotiations get. Science is all about what's called the principle of parsimony. The simpler you make it, the easier it is. You don't get Newton's laws of motion written in a volume. You get them written in one line, which you can express with one mathematical equation. So the simpler you make it, the easier it is, at least to make an assessment, if not to actually draft the text. The final point I want to make is that I think IPCC's fifth assessment report, for all the discussion on the political negotiations that have taken place to finalize the summary for policymakers, I think makes clear three essential points. One, it has given us till date the highest degree of certainty with regard to the impacts of climate change, the imperatives of the need to take early action if we want to avoid crossing the 2 degrees Celsius goal, and thirdly, it gives us specific numbers, the total carbon budget in terms of cumulative emissions till 2100, but with a fairly clear stipulation of what is required to be achieved by 2050 if we want to achieve the target at 2100. Second, it tells us that the Cancun pledges do not amount to adequacy, and to my mind this emphasizes the need for the negotiations Lima onwards leading up to Paris for a sound mechanism to assess adequacy of any pledges and for a mechanism to review the pledges, come back to the conference table, and if necessary revise these pledges upward, so that you get a process which those who don't like it can feel happy that it is not a top-down process, but it's a bottom-up process which reconciles itself to the feeling which has been laid not by you and me, but by nature, as to how much carbon the atmosphere can take. That's the top. The top is not a political decision that you and I have taken, it's what the science tells us the atmosphere can take. If you want to do a bottom-up, you do a bottom-up, but you weigh the adequacy, given the ceiling that you have, and then make an assessment and revise the pledges upwards. And finally, as I said to begin with, all the other factors, and if you see the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, I think this would make it clear, all the factors of financing, technology, etc. are linked to the achievement of the mitigation goals that are set. We shouldn't miss sight of this fact. There are a lot of conference rooms where a lot of these discussions take place. I think it's quite easy to get lost in these, in the minutiae of the discussions here, but it is equally important for us to keep our eye on the ball. A juggler has 10 balls floating in the air, but please remember there's one red ball in that whole thing which is the most important, and that's the mitigation goal. We should not lose sight of it, both globally and nationally, and I think we need to also spend more time, it's not my brief, but some time on discussing the Indian role and position and targets in this going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.